Integrity of research is just fundamental to the advancement of knowledge. If what goes in isn't true and honest, what comes out at the other end really isn't knowledge. If you know that the research that you're depending on, or that you're reading, or that the public's learning about is sound research, then it creates that trust that you can rely on it. And trust is at the core of research because for several reasons, one of them being when you read a paper, you listen to a presentation, you expect what the scientist is telling you is accurate and true and well done. The public trusts that too. And one of the early kind of scandals, or one of the many scandals, of course, was ClimateGate. And I'm sure most of you have heard back that from 2010, but that really kind of shook the public's trust in science, in climate science for quite a while. And then related to the public, not only because public policy is based on science, health advances are based on science, but a lot of our science is funded by the public, by the federal agencies, by states. And if the public cannot trust the science that it's learning about or that it's understanding, then it's not going to be willing to fund that research or that science for much longer. And then another reason for integrity is just stewardship. We have limited resources, whether they're financial or human or whatever. And if we're wasting them through poor science, through duplicative science, whatever, then it's just wasting our resources. Oh.
Just click and send me this for the
Oh, okay. So these are some fairly recent headlines, although the ClimateGate is a bit old. This one was just at the top where Duke University, they found one of its researchers had been embezzling thousands of dollars, but they didn't do anything about it, and it went on for quite a long time. And then they had a whistleblower, and they ignored the whistleblower, and the federal government ignored the whistleblower who blew the whistle on this deceit. So the whistleblower got his brother, who was a lawyer, to file a claim in civil court, and they won. And he won $110 million, well, they finally had to make a $110 million fine, Duke was fined, and the whistleblower, due to the law under which he did it, got a third of that. So even though he lost his job, probably didn't sleep for 6 years and everything, he finally came out at the end, and the rest of the money went back to the federal government because this person had embezzled, basically wasted millions and millions of dollars from the NIH. This was one of the first studies, I know it's from 2005, but it's one of the first studies that was actually done asking scientists, and these were funded by the National Institutes of Health, about what kind of practices they do. Practices you'd have to have an anonymous survey to answer them, but the first one is falsifying or cooking your research data. And here the N is 3,247, and 0.3% admitted to doing that. So that's about 100 scientists in this sample who actually admitted to fabricating or falsifying data. And then as you go down, some of the, quote, the actions aren't as bad as that, but the percentages get large better, to changing the design, methodology, or results of a study in response to pressure from a funding source. 15% of the sample said that they did that. So again, this was one of the first pieces of evidence that there are some pretty detrimental research practices going on, and there have been studies since this. And then so this, when they're published and people talk about them, kind of creates, it can erode the trust that the public has in science. And these are some articles just within, I think they're all within the last 2 months, about building trust, rebuilding trust. But this one over here, mistrust in scientific articles exacerbates researchers' workloads, really says in this article, was just saying how by scientists not trusting other scientists' work, it's making them have to do a lot more. If you don't trust the work that you're building on, then that can create a problem. So from this National Academies report, this was just a schematic of how complex the research enterprise is. In the middle, you have you individual researchers, But in the other blue boxes, which are the participants and stakeholders, you have research institutions, the Congress, the media, the public, journals and societies, research sponsors and regulators. And then all the orange boxes are the research enterprise system and processes. So you've got incentives and rewards, research misconduct policies, etc. And all the arrows are going both ways. So there's a lot of interactions, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of processes. It's not a simple system, and that adds to some of the issues. This came from the NSF Inspector General at a conference I was at 2 years ago. And this is the NSF Inspector General's view of kind of where research integrity as a general topic fits. Over here you have this oval is research administration. The far one is the grant administration. So that's the pre-award, the post-award, the spending and everything. And here is the academic administration. So this is in a kind of a university setting. But they're talking about the interactions of all these things. And when we talk about research integrity topics, that includes conflicts of interest, intellectual property, data. IRB is for the human subjects. IACUC is the protection of vertebrate animals. Biosafety is recombinant DNA, infectious agents, all that good stuff. RCR training is this responsible conduct of research training that now several of the federal funding agencies mandate. Authorship issues kind of off here. Mentoring and traineeship, honor codes, employee disciplinary processes. But right in the middle is this, what they call research misconduct, FFP standing for fabrication of data, falsification of data, and plagiarism. And now there is a federal regulation that defines those three things. And so for the NSF's purposes, if there's an allegation of misconduct, FFP in an NSF, not necessarily just award, but it can also be a proposal, it is the NSF OIG who actually does the investigations or contacts the institution and says, we've had an allegation of plagiarism against this person, you need to investigate. So when we're talking about integrity, what are the absolute flaws? What are the compliance pieces? We have laws. So for instance, the Animal Welfare Act in this country, 1966, dictates how an institution like UNH can use vertebrate animals in research. That's just one. And then those tend to get translated into government regulations. So for instance, the Animal Welfare Act was translated into federal regulations about the use of vertebrate animals, that then the agency that oversees that is the USDA. So every year we have an unannounced inspection by the USDA veterinarian to see if we're complying with the government regulations and the federal law regarding the use of animals. That's just an example. Most of our, most government regulations that we have here are given to us as part of the funding. So they'll say, if you want $1 of, let's just say, NSF funding, you have to follow all these regulations that are attached to that funding. So if we want to use human subjects in research, we have to follow the federal regulations on human subjects if we want $1 of funding to do human subjects research. Professional codes also dictate how people or guide individuals, how they're going to act when they're conducting research, and those are all over the board. One of them that I'm most familiar with is the American Psychological Associations. That's 33 pages long, their professional code of conduct, because they deal with research subjects, both animal, human clients, the whole gamut. Then we have institutional policies. And even though you might not think it, we actually don't have that many institutional policies related to the conduct of research. And for our purposes, what we tend to do is if there's a government regulation, then we'll make a UNH policy so we can make it specific to our environment. And then this other area that kind of guides people about their thinking and their actions, what they're going to do is personal convictions. And that can be anything from your culture, your religion, your upbringing, all how you were trained, all those kinds of things. So when we look at it from a kind of integrity perspective, the floor is compliance. You know, if you're going to do the bare minimum, at least you should comply, because if you don't do that, then that can really get you into trouble. But there's lots of ways that one can improve research or make it much more rigorous or sound through best practices, that even if you don't do them, you'll still be complying with the bare minimum for whatever it is. So this is just to kind of put things in perspective a little, is all the way over there you have what we call the ethical, the squeaky clean research, nobody can critique you in any way. Or start running over here, what you might call the smaller things, like people who cite papers that they've never read, so they don't actually know if they're citing them properly, maybe not including all the data and not explaining why you drop data points, these things. And they tend, as you move over this way, they get more serious in nature to what I would call serious violations, is usually non-compliance. And then all the way over to here that we call our misconduct, this is the FFP, but when you do it using federal funds, you can land up in jail because then it becomes fraud. And there have been researchers who've been to jail because they have deceived the government, usually by intentionally submitting proposals that contain fabricated or falsified data. They get money, federal government, and then they get found out. And that's when the Department of Justice gets involved. And actually one of the first researchers who went to jail for that was from the University of Vermont, Dr. Eric Pullman. And he went to jail for a year for basically getting around $10 million from the National Institutes of Health by knowingly including fabricated and falsified data in his grant applications. So the National Academy's report basically says that research misconduct, the really bad apples, the FFP, is only a tiny piece of it, but that's the stuff that usually makes the headlines. It's all what they call the detrimental research practices that really erode the quality of science. And these are just some examples that they give. And why does this matter? Because it costs. Research misconduct, detrimental research practices have a cost. And the costs, as they identified, is the millions of dollars in what they call direct costs, the lost years of training and work, the advancement of knowledge being impaired, and science as an institution is less affected or less trusted by the public. So when we talk about responsible conduct of research, research integrity is actually an area, just like, and these are the kinds of areas when we're talking about, these are the topic areas that are generally included in it. And these are some more that are what I would call more up and coming. In the last 5 years, they've started to be included, and they're actually included in the National Academy's report. And notice harassment is one of those. That never was on the kind of the environment and how people treated each other, was never really on the radar of responsible conduct of research. But the National Science Foundation is one of the first agencies now where institutions have to report to the National Science Foundation if there's any administrative action against a PI who is receiving NSF funds. And the National Institutes of Health is going that way. So this is all within the last year that these new policies have been enacted. So the research environment is becoming a research integrity issue because it can affect how people perform their science. These are our UNH policies that address specifically issues of integrity. And apart from the first two, they really come straight from federal regulations. And the first two were enacted to kind of codify the value of openness. That is, we don't do classified work here. If you want to do classified work, you have to do it at home if you've got the facilities for doing it. And that's because the belief is that when you do research here, you should be sharing that. It should be open and transparent. So when we talk about research integrity at UNH, we're talking about responsibilities as a member of the community, kind of expectations for conducting research, and the different roles. And what I mean about the different roles is being a person conducting your own research, doing research with others, and maybe supervising others who do research. We have a standing university committee, the Responsible Conduct of Research Committee, that has been around for it was an advisory committee for its first few years, and then it was made a standing committee, I think back in 2009. And Professor Thane is on that committee, and she's been on it for quite a while. But the committee decided that instead of coming up with kind of a code of conduct for trying to capture everybody here. They like the AGU code of conduct, and now you've got a handout here. It's a much lengthier document. This is just the piece that codifies, I think it's like 15 principles. But because a lot of members of AGU, a lot of our faculty and students and scientists here are members of AGU, they thought it was a good way of saying, this is a good way to kind of guide the conduct of researchers here at UNH without having to come up with your own, because it's a lot of work. So these are the topics that Alyssa and Annie asked me to address specifically. There are experts on campus who can get into the nitty-gritty. And the first one I would say for this one, if you have any questions about data, data management, anything to do with your data, we have a wonderful resource on campus. Her name is Dr. Patricia Condon. She's actually the Research Data Services Librarian. That is her role in the library. And if you want to, you know, institute better practices in your lab, or as a student, you're like, how the heck do I handle all this data? What are some of the issues? She will consult with you. She'll come to your lab. She'll do whatever. She's here to help you with research data issues. And why that's important, because for a lot of scientists, a lot of disciplines, a lot of programs, data is key. Without the data, you don't have your science. Maybe less in the humanities, or data really isn't data. It's just something that's a little different. But for a lot of people, the integrity of the research is tied to the data. This is one of her slides. So basically, she's talking about why data is important, because you lose it, you need to be able to find it, you need to secure it, you need to make sure that you can get at it for years and years and years, depending on the valid, how long your data is, quote, valid. You might want to share it, and that's becoming much more of an issue now, particularly with journals. Some of the journals are actually taking to now, they won't accept articles unless you send the data with them, so that then it can be shared. And in some disciplines, reproducibility is an issue, and so the sharing of data that others can use is a key component of that. This is just an example of what happens if you can't produce your data. I think this was a PhD student going to defend her dissertation, couldn't present the data. So therefore, if you've got an article, you can't present the data, the thing is, well, did you make it up? Where did it go? So Retraction Watch, if you haven't heard of this, is a really interesting blog that talks about all things, all retractions, all sciences, things going on with papers, things going on at universities. It's an interesting, I think they call it like a window into the conduct of science or something like that. But it's fascinating to see what goes on. You know, somebody had 6 papers retracted and they couldn't find the data because they'd had a flood. You know, it's kind of like the dog ate my homework, but it's that kind of stuff. So anyway, so you have to have a little humor in here. Ph.D. comics gives you that humor. And actually, I teach a grad class, and we had Patty come in on Tuesday and talking about this, and one of our grad students said, Patty showed this slide, and then the student told the story. Not quite this, is that she had a whole thesis on her laptop, just finished it, went out, came back, and somebody had stolen her laptop. No backups, no nothing. So it's like, so she's like, I can really relate to that cartoon, but in a slightly different way. We actually have a policy here at UNH on ownership, management, and sharing of research data. And basically what it says in a nutshell is that UNH owns all your data. All research data is owned legally by UNH, but UNH does not want your data, believe you me, but a legal ownership. So what it does is for faculty, you have custody, the university grants you, you're responsible for your data. You're responsible for storing it, retaining it according to the policy, sharing it if you need to share it, all those kinds of things. For students, your advisor or your PI is the custodian of your data. So please, if you leave at the end of your degree, do not take off with your lab notebooks. That's what instigated this policy back in 2004 on a federal grant. The policy addresses these components, but it's important that you understand not only your responsibilities, but what your rights are to those data too. So it's a two-way street. In your AGU code of conduct, you'll see that they address data. So this is just their principle on data, which kind of is fairly cut and dry, but. Annie and Alyssa also asked me to address self-plagiarism. This is one of these things that people say, you can't steal from yourself. There's no such thing as self-plagiarism. So this is the UNH policy on misconduct, okay? That's this FFP. This mirrors the federal regulation. So there's nothing flowery in this. It's fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. And note it's in the proposing, performing, reviewing of scholarly activities or in reporting them. And then there's also a component which is retaliation against somebody who makes an allegation. But most importantly is the FFP. And if you look at plagiarism, because they asked me to address self-plagiarism, it's the appropriation of another person's ideas without giving proper credit. So how does that turn into self-plagiarism? Self-plagiarism is when you use material that's already been disseminated or published, and you do not indicate that you've already released it out there, whether that's a presentation or a paper or part of a paper or results or whatever. There's this resource here that actually has a very good description of self-plagiarism and why it matters. But basically, the intent is not letting the reader know that this is not new information because you don't cite that you've already published it before. And then it gets a little more, if you do it a little bit more extensively, it can lead to retractions of papers. So this came out of Retraction Watch on August 8th of this year. So the piece about self-plagiarism really is the article duplicates significant parts of a paper that had already appeared in blah, 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 blah publication. One of the conditions of submission of a paper for publication is that the authors explicitly declare that the paper has not been previously published and is not under consideration for publication anywhere. So when significant parts of a paper are put into another paper and then submitted, then some journals will consider that duplication. It's not dual publication, it's just, it can be redundancy or it can be duplicate publication. So this is happening more and more because of the software they've got to check for plagiarism can pick up whole chunks that have been cut and pasted into another paper and then submitted. Another topic that they asked me to address was authorship, and this is really, really all over the board. There's no regulation, there's professional, there's lab, kind of within your lab, how do you deal with authorship? Professional societies sometimes address it. Journals are now addressing it. This infographic comes from the Office of Research Integrity, which is a federal agency that does all the investigations into misconduct and misuse of federal money in the public health service agencies. So it's really in the biomedical field, but they're kept pretty busy. So they put out a series of infographics, and this one is on authorship. This is straight from the AGU Code of Conduct. It's good because it kind of conceptually talks about authorship, but it doesn't actually say what do you have to do to be an author, which is fine because it covers, you know, a lot of disciplines. So from the AGU Publications Committee comes their definition of an author, and I had to like cut and paste this because it wasn't in a very pretty way to do it. But basically what they say, only individuals who have significantly contributed to the research and preparation of the article should be listed as authors. That's not very explicit. They share responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. One of the much more widespread definitions of authorship comes from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So a lot of medical journals ascribe to these guidelines. And so they explicitly say, if you're going to be an author on a paper in one of our journals, this is what you have to do. And notice they're all ands. There's no ors in there. So you have to have done all of these things. So it's much more concrete than the AGU, but you know, There's all, I had many, 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 many different examples of what it means to be an author. So they also asked me to introduce, just briefly talk about intellectual property. I know enough to be dangerous. I can tell you what intellectual property assets are, but I can also tell you the office on campus who will help you with it. I got this slide from, some of you might have known Dr. Maria Emanuel, who used to work for UNH Innovation. She did a lot on copyrights, patents, and trademarks. She did a lot of education. So she provided me this slide with some examples of software licenses from CCOM. These are three of the different types. There are three different types of patents you can get. So these are examples from UNH, and I know, even I know this is a plant patent. That's one of the types of plant patents you can get. This is a utility patent. And then that is an example of copyright of the Mariana Trench map. So these are examples, but if you have questions about intellectual property at all, I can give you the contact person because I don't know enough to be useful. So talking about research integrity generally, there's lots to think about. The National Academy's report has this checklist for researchers, but going back to that schematic of all the stakeholders, they also have a checklist for institutions, for sponsors, for journals, and for professionals in society. So when they're addressing research integrity, they're not just picking on the researchers and saying, you need to do all these things. They're also talking about all the major stakeholders saying, journals, you need to change the way you do this. Sponsors, you need to change the way you do this. Professional societies, you need to change the way you do this. Because a lot of it is the incentives that make people do the things that they do. And the structures and the incentives of the academy are not always aligned with really rigorous research. Pressure to publish or perish is one of those. And this is from the UK RIO, so the UK Research Integrity Office put out this checklist. It's much more detailed than the other one, but this is particularly for beginning researchers. These are all the things that you might need to consider when you're planning a research project. And there are plenty more of this checklists around. This is available on the web, and I'll be giving this PowerPoint to Annie and Elisa to post too. So what do we have here at UNH that can help or address? We have incoming PhD student training. It is required. That's the Graduate Council. Back in 2011, the Graduate Council decided that every single incoming PhD student had to complete RCR training in their first semester. So in 3 weeks, we'll be doing that with the 9th cohort. The National Science Foundation and the US Department of Agriculture's National Institute of Food and Agriculture has a mandated RCR training. So for the National Science Foundation, it's any undergraduate, graduate student, or postdoc who's funded by that grant has to complete RCR training at the institution. The NIFA, the USDA NIFA is more broad. It's any person on a grant that NIFA funds, they have to complete RCR training. The NIH also has one, but theirs is grant type specific, and we don't have any of those types of grants here that trigger it. So what do we have here? We have web-based instruction. We have 12 online modules about those 12, at least early topics of research, research topics. This is the web page for them, and they're listed down the left-hand side. The HIPAA one is for people who have to do HIPAA privacy stuff, but you can take that too. We also have a library guide, and this is an online resource that, and we call it a library guide because it's housed within the library software system. And all these topics, if you click on, say, human subjects, it'll bring you to a page that has training, in the news, key documents, federal resources, UNH resources. These are all different tabs, YouTube videos, cases, books. So for every one of those topics, we have all these resources listed, and this is kept current too. So this is a centralized place that you can access any time of the night or day or from wherever you are to look up top resources for research integrity topics. We have the endorsement of the AGU Code of Conduct. We also have a class that I co-teach with Dr. Emmanuel every fall semester. We've been doing it, well, I've been doing it since 2005. It's an interdisciplinary graduate seminar, ethics in research and scholarship. And Annie has participated in that. And I think that's why she asked me to come. We also started a lecture series, we meaning the RCR committee, Science on the Edge, the Grand Challenge of Truth in Science. So last November, we had one of the co-founders of Retraction Watch, Dr. Ivan Aransky, came and gave a lecture. And we haven't sorted out this year's lecture speaker. So if you have any people who you think would make a good guest speaker or lecturer, presenter on a topic that kind of falls in this general area, then please email me, because right now we're in our selection process for this year. These are other non-UNH resources, and they're all over the map. There are actually international codes of ethics now. There's the World Congress on Research Integrity that's met for 6 years, and they've been coming out with things. They have something called the Singapore Statement, which addresses globally, it's about 10 principles of research integrity, and it helps when you're thinking about international collaborations because of cultural issues. There are nations, particularly a lot of the European nations, who have codes of ethics. The US doesn't. The Netherlands is the latest one. They just updated theirs, I think, this year. Professional codes, journal requirements, because journals are on the front line of a lot of this. The image manipulation, plagiarism, dual publication, those things, they're becoming quite tough. Now a lot of journals automatically will run papers, submitted papers through plagiarism software as a start. And now the biomedical journals are now starting to run all images through image manipulation software too, because they're finding this is a big problem. If you don't know about it, the Public Library of Science, PLOS, has a 10 simple rules collection. This comes out of PLOS computational biology, and they've amassed about 60 to 65 papers that people have written about different topic areas, and they all are in the same format, the 10 simple rules of whatever it is. And these just happen to be 4 that I selected that happen to be on topics of research integrity. They are great teaching tools. They have things for like setting up a journal club, how to do all these different, how to author a paper, those kinds of things. They are very general in nature. They're not just addressing computational biology. So these are a really good resource for teaching kind of fundamentals of a topic area. A library, we have a subscription to Science and Engineering Ethics. It speaks for itself. Retraction Watch is a really good teaching tool because there are probably at least 4 blog posts a day about something to do with research integrity in the literature. A couple of national websites, one of them, I think one of them is supported by NSF out of the University of Illinois. This is a fairly recent publication about research integrity and doing research globally, so kind of introducing the whole, when you're working across cultures, across languages, distance. This is actually linked in our library too. It's downloadable as a free PDF. So I'm within time. So if anybody, I'm happy to take any questions if anybody's got any.
Okay, so I'll give you a case.
Me first. The statement that UNH owns your data, that surprises me a bit, because when I think about particularly graduate students, some are grant funded, some are potentially collaborating with industry, that industry is providing their data.
Yep.
Some have to sign non-disclosure agreements. Some students are not funded at all and are paying not just for their degree, but also the collection of data. So UNH's policy is that they own all of those data. How does that hold up in courts? Or would you comment on that, given the wide range of situations, administrative situations in which students find themselves?
Sure. So there are a lot of exceptions. There's usually an asterisk with every blank statement like that. So it says something like UNH owns the data except on the cases of the following. And that would be if there's an agreement, particularly industry, that they won't just come here. without an agreement. There'll be an agreement ahead of time signed saying the industry may own their data, and that's fine because there's an agreement. People, grant funding, all the federal agencies as part of grant funds give the stewardship of all the data generated under that to the university. So actually the university's stance about owning all the data is based on one of the Office of Management Budget principles about federal funding. Now, when I say own the data, and of course this gets everybody read, UNH owns the data unless there's an asterisk and there's some agreement that says somebody else owns it. But UNH doesn't want the data. And that's where it gets to. Ownership, it's just, that's the legal precedent on which the policy is founded. UNH doesn't keep your data. It doesn't tell you necessarily where to store it unless you're using human subjects. It's all these things. So really, it's the legal ownership. But where you keep it, how you keep it, who you share it with, how, that's all up to the faculty or the student. So really legally owning it is something you don't have to worry about, and you really don't have to think about unless you're a student who's going to like be on a federal grant, say, oh, those are my lab research, those are my lab notebooks, and I'll take them when I leave. That's when you have to worry about it. And again, that's the case that instigated this policy because of that. And it was a federal award too. So actually the institution was responsible for those data and somebody took them. So students should be able to take copies. Anybody who collaborates should have access to them. And one of the statements in there is anybody who is responsible, who helped collect, generate the data, should have access to those data and be able to take copies of them. So again, the ownership is what everybody really focuses on, but it's the least important part of the policy when it comes to practical application of it. Does that, I know it probably doesn't satisfy you, but does that help?
Very much.
Okay.
I know there's no easy answer to that. It's
Right.
It just struck me.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so an example of something where I was not able to obey one of the rules there, which was that all the co-authors should have read and sort of agreed to the publication. And so I had a student from Japan who was here for a year on some kind of program in computer science, and I hired him for the summer, and he made a significant contribution to the project. So I put him on the paper, but then I couldn't contact him later. I did my best. I got people who knew him to look at his, try and get to him through Facebook, and with no success at all. Just didn't respond to any of that. Yeah. So, but I put him on the paper anyway. I mean, was that wrong to actually?
Well, one thing I'd say is, what does the journal say? If the journal you publish in says to be an author, you must have done, like the CCOM-JHC says, you must have done these things and things, then if you had asked the journal, they'd have probably said yes, because he didn't read the paper. But if you feel, you being the faculty member, you feel comfortable that he did a significant contribution, you feel that it's okay. And it's all, this is the really, like, the glass is, not even a tenth full, is if somebody came back to question that paper, could you justify what he wrote, what he contributed, are you confident in all that? And if you are, I'd say, as you're probably the first author, right? Or the primary, then you can do that. That's your right. But there's a lot of other things. It's like, what would the journal say?
Yeah. I mean, quite frankly, I don't know what the journal policy was. It may have indeed have been that everyone should have agreed to it. Although I am, some journals I submit to, they actually send emails to everybody and they'll have to respond, or else they
or some of them have signed. Everybody has to sign them.
I would have actually been quite uncomfortable if I'd gone to the journal and they'd said no, because then I would have had to exclude him, and that to me would have felt
wrong. I mean, that's your experience, that's your purview, and you felt you did the right thing. So again, the authorship is the least black and white of all of these, just because there's not like a federal policy. There are journal requirements. There are, say maybe even professional societies, there might be, like the AGU. So again, it's one of those that's all over the map. I'd say as long as you feel comfortable with it, I think that's fine. So this is the only time at UNH that it's been ever made public. Of course, so sometimes things don't make public. I was actually I was shocked to read it or hear about it when I came into work. But the way the institution did it, I think, was fairly professional. if you read Retraction Watch, if you read broadly, I mean, this stuff comes over email because this is what I do. It's not unusual. There was just a researcher down from UVA who just went to criminal trial for taking all NSF funds, putting in proposals, taking the money, and then spending it on his own stuff. He had already been in jail, I think, or not in jail because he hadn't been judged by that, but the university fired him, and he's now free, but he can't get a job, he can't, whatever. So it's not every day, but it's not like UNH's, which was, in my 27 years, it's the first time that it had happened. It's probably more common than we'd like to think, but I don't want everyone to start going, oh my gosh, everybody does this all the time. And it's those who, I hate to say this because it sounds really cynical, those who get caught. Because there's a lot of money floating around in this whole, when you think about research globally, or just in this country, there's a lot of money floating around. I think that I saw a statistic that healthcare fraud is a lot higher than suspected research fraud, but there's many more billions of dollars go into the whole healthcare system. I think as a proportion, it's probably very small about how much is fraudulently used, but it's definitely out there, because the Office of the Inspector Generals of all the agencies are kept pretty busy investigating. A lot of them have purview, like the NSF, over research, the federal funds piece of it. They do a report to Congress every 6 months on all their investigations, fraud investigations, research misconduct investigations. And there's a pretty lengthy laundry list in there of every 6 months about what they're looking into. So it's not common, but it's definitely not once every 29 years or 7 years that it happens to another institution, unfortunately. I think we're very good here. Maybe we're lucky too. But compared with some of the institutions, we don't get that much funding. There are some institutions that get many, many tens, hundreds of millions more than we do. And I hate to say it because you're not the biomedical field, but that's where it seems to be more prevalent.
Any more questions?
Thank you, Julie.